Hi everyone, and welcome to this month's Wildlife Wednesday monthly roundup brought to you from Jackson Hole Ecotour Adventures. I'm your host, Tenley Thompson, and Tyler Greenlee is off on adventures this week, so you guys are stuck with just me. But let's go ahead and get started with the latest and greatest updates from all over the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. First and foremost, with Laura and some footage from Roy talking about beavers.
Oh, hi. I wanted to drop in real quick to tell you about a fantastic sighting I had this week with guide Roy Cruz. We were driving up a snow-covered riverbank in the park and happened to spot a beaver on the other side of the water. He was super busy gnawing on some cottonwood trees. He had actually gnawed around the base of a tree, and the tree almost hit the beaver in the head, which I found really funny. I wonder how many beavers out there in the wild actually get injured or even killed by trees that have fallen on their head unintentionally. Beavers are vegetarian. They like to eat the cambium layer of the tree. So they use their gnawing incisors, which are reinforced with iron, to nibble off that bark and use it as a food source. Yeah, he might also use part of that tree as structure to build a new dam, which will back up the water from flowing in the river and create like a pool to grow more of his favorite foods, which are those aquatic plants. This beaver was just super fun to watch. He was working really hard to get that tree down. And once he did, he was able to drag it down off the riverbank and into the water. He must be really strong for his body size. Yeah, and check out that nice fur coat that the beaver is wearing. Back in the early 1800s, mountain men or fur trappers came out to wild places like Jackson Hole to trap beaver for their wool. Now, wool was used to make really fashionable top hats that every gentleman wanted in the East or maybe even off in Europe. But fashion changed right around 1845 into 1850, and silk became more valuable, more popular to use to make into those hats. So there wasn't as much demand anymore for that beaver wool, and a lot of those mountain men found themselves out of a job and became more like guides on the Oregon Trail or to take people into more remote places in the West. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.
Thanks, Laura and Roy. Beavers are always one of my favorite things to see year-round on tour, because who doesn't love watching beavers? But I certainly have never gotten close to seeing an actual beaver felled by a tree, although I have heard of it certainly happening. There is a couple pictures online that I've seen, but certainly a really rare occurrence. So pretty cool stuff there. Next, let's tune in with our guide Bo with a video he shot last year about the elk migration coming out of the National Elk Refuge into Grand Teton Yellowstone National Park and the federal lands surrounding. In the next couple weeks, we're about to see the same thing happening, and we're really excited to see these elk moving and following the green wave.
Hey everybody, Bo here, coming to you from Grand Teton National Park, and more specifically, the Grovant River bottom. So here's the Grovant River behind me, starting to fill up for the springtime as all of our snow melts. Wanted to come down to this spot because it's an interesting location, specifically to talk about our elk migration and how the elk do this unique thing that ecologists have dubbed surfing the green wave. So to give you a little perspective of where we are, currently I'm standing in National Park land, or the Department of the Interior. On the other side of that river, over there, is the National Elk Refuge. So if you've been on tour with us, or if you've visited Jackson Hole in the wintertime, pretty hard to miss all those thousands of animals, those elk that live close to town. Now what's happening right now is those elk are getting ready to catch the wave, to start surfing the green wave, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And when they do that, they leave this refuge property cross this Gros Ventre River, and then get onto national park property. Some of these animals will push all the way north into northern Grand Teton National Forest property, and some all the way up into Yellowstone. Now it's an interesting thing that happens, but these elk have to move because they're following their food. And even though, if you can see behind me, it's snowing right now, which you would think, gosh, maybe those animals want to stay south. In fact, they want to push north right now because it is the spring, it is April, but they're pushing north to go get better food. So stay tuned on this little section. We're going to talk about this idea of surfing the green wave in the springtime in our environment here, and show you some really cool footage of our elk moving through the landscape. Surfing the green wave is a theory, a hypothesis that states that these herbivores, which are including elk, moose, mule deer, they like to stay what's called the leading edge. And what they mean by that is these elk keep track of where their forage, their food, has the highest nutrient quality. So we do the same thing at our grocery stores, where we choose, baby asparagus, baby arugula, baby romaine lettuce. All the versions of those plants have the highest nutrient quality when they are young. The elk are doing the same thing with the forage that they are finding on the natural landscape. So ecologists have dubbed this surfing the green wave because these animals are in fact staying on the edge of where the spring and the warmer temperatures have allowed their forage to start to green up. Now, what's interesting is that the elk will also keep track of if they've pushed too far north, if they're kind of past the leading edge, so that quality of food is actually not quite high enough because spring and the warmer temperatures have not reached those areas. It's really fascinating to watch these animals move through the landscape and keep track of this. Sometimes we'll see them at a location like this footage is being shown, kind of at the center part of Grand Teton National Park. If you see them get too far north, they'll come back a little bit, retrace their steps, get to that higher food quality, and then wait for the new grasses to continue pushing further north. Rather remarkable to watch. Surfing the green wave. The elk are the masters. Well, there you have it, folks. You can go surfing in a snowstorm in the spring in Wyoming. You just have to be an elk surfing the green wave. It's pretty cool to watch these animals move through this ecosystem by the thousands, watching them every day as they push further and further north. It really does feel like when we're on tour this time of year that you are in Africa, right on the Serengeti. I can say that because I actually did used to live in Africa, and it feels very similar to that. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Bo. A great look at our elk herd and the green wave migration. Now, of course, we welcome you to follow all of us on social, both Jackson Hole Eco Tour Adventures, our account. I'm sure Kelsey can link our Instagram for us. She's moderating our comment section tonight, so everybody say hi to Kelsey. But also our individual guides. Laura Krukoshki, she's LK Rushes at Instagram, and of course Bo, you just saw, is Bo_knows_outside_. And if you don't know those two accounts, they're a lot of fun to watch. Lots and lots of great details from the Great Yellowstone ecosystem. All right, next up, I have something really extraordinary and really special for you guys, but I suppose I better say that viewer discretion is advised. If you've got sort of a sensitive stomach, I do have pictures of a dead animal upcoming here. So if you don't want to see a dead mountain lion, maybe fast forward if you're watching this later for about 2 to 3 minutes. But we had a very unusual situation this week that we wanted to share with you. Our guide, Mark Byral, was out on a cross-country ski adventure, and right underneath this beautiful Douglas fir, he found a dead mountain lion. It was probably about a 2 to 3 year old female mountain lion. It was not located in Grand Teton National Park, just outside the park. And our guide, he notified Game and Fish, who collected the carcass, and they sent it to Laramie for an autopsy to see what on earth happened. The results came back this week, and it ends up that this cat actually died from avian influenza. It actually contracted the disease from eating a Canada goose that was infected, but just based on the stomach contents they found inside the cat. This is an extraordinarily rare situation, but something that is increasing in the area. This is the 4th mountain lion this year that they found that has contracted avian influenza. So really kind of a surprising situation. And great work, Mark, for letting Game and Fish know so that they could properly investigate and understand what's going on in the progression of this disease. It's really, really interesting to see how H5N1 is changing here in North America. So for those of you guys who are not necessarily familiar with different strains of influenza, you know, we are of course possibly able to get all sorts of different kinds of flus, including H1N1, but H5N1 is not an influenza that we're seeing great incidence of yet in the United States in people. But, you know, that could change. One of the things about influenzas is that they can change how they transmit. Right now, H5N1 is generally speaking thought of as sometimes called the bird flu because it mostly comes from wild and domestic poultry and then is transmitted from there into other species. In this case, it was a Canada goose transmitting it to a mountain lion. But yeah, we haven't seen very many cases here in the United States of domestic poultry giving it to humans, or there are no cases we know of wild poultry, like wild birds giving it to humans. But 4 cases in Teton County this year of wild birds giving it to mountain lions who seem particularly predisposed to it. So thanks very much to Mark for sort of that latest and greatest straight from our guide's mouth about some breaking edge research happening here in the Great Yellowstone ecosystem. All right, so I will let everybody know, of course, that my favorite part of Wildlife Wednesday is that I'm here to answer your questions live after our trivia question of the month, which is what's coming up next. So if you have a question for me about the Great Yellowstone ecosystem or the natural world, whether you're 5 or 105, we love questions. Feel free to ask me. Tyler's not here to answer all the really hard, complicated ones this week, so see if you can stump me, particularly those bird questions that I usually defer to him on because he knows way more about birds than I ever hope to. But in the meantime, it's time for my second favorite part of the program, which is our trivia question of the month. So, as always, our trivia question is sponsored by our EcoTour Adventures web store. If you're looking for all sorts of cool goodies from the Great Yellowstone ecosystem, homemade, handcrafted art, ceramics, wonderful books about the Great Yellowstone ecosystem, EcoTour Adventure swag, we've got all sorts of stuff for there. We actually started this web store as part of the COVID pandemic as a way to help pay for the health insurance benefits for our guides, and we continue to operate, and 100% of the proceeds go to our guide staff. Our sponsored item of the month are these brand new socks that we've added to the web store. If you've always wanted to wear moose on your feet, I am here to tell you that we've got moose for your feet. So hopefully Kelsey can link to our newest product. As always, if you've enjoyed our program, it's here free of charge. We're happy to do this for everybody. But some folks like to give the guides a little bit of something in thanks. And if you want to do that, there is a donation page on the web store as well. All right, so the way this is going to work, guys, is if you know the answer to the trivia question, you're just going to answer in the comment section. We're going to go with last month's trivia question first, and then we'll do this month's trivia question next. Now, we've already picked a winner for last month's trivia question, but go ahead and let me know in the comment section what you think the answer is. And the question was, what year was the elk refuge established? This is the National Elk Refuge. A, 2001, B, 1912, C, 1872, or D, 1956? Does anybody know the answer to this one? I'll give you guys a couple seconds to go ahead and put it in the comment section before I answer. And of course, the answer is 1912. The National Elk Refuge was established in 1912. One of the first, the first land animal refuge established by the United States for the benefit of wildlife, not people. So up until that point, we had created some national wildlife refuges, mostly offshore islands to protect nesting bird species, but we hadn't taken what was considered land of value. These offshore islands were just rocky outcroppings that nobody could do anything with. National Elk Refuge was arable land. The idea that we would take land that was used by people and usable by people and give it for the exclusive use of wildlife instead was quite an innovative idea of its time. And 1912 was the first time we did that with a land animal by creating land and setting aside land just north of the town of Jackson to protect wintering elk populations. Now, to be fair, we were doing it for a multitude of reasons, one of which was that the local people relied on those elk to eat during the winter, and several massive die-offs had resulted in such reduction of the herd numbers, it was thought that they would not survive without human intervention. I probably think at that point they probably wouldn't have. There is a couple really bad winters that occur. I think one's 1911, 1912, 1918, and then there's one in the 1920s. But the 1912 winter was particularly devastating. And they say, this is a little morbid, but you could have walked for more than a mile outside of the town of Jackson to the north and not stepped on the snow for so many dead elk bodies. You could have just stepped on the bodies and not the snow and never touched the ground. So many were lost. It's thought around 50,000 elk once migrated to the southern ends of the valley. And at one point, we lost well over 20,000 of them in one winter. So definitely great that we've got that federally set aside land now, the National Elk Refuge, and it was set aside in 1912. So, okay, this second question sort of correlates a little bit about this. Now, this is the one where you have the chance to win an EcoTour gift card for our web store if you answer correctly. So go ahead and let me know in the comment section what the answer is to this month's question, which is, who collects the shed antlers? See that elk who just dropped his antlers there on the National Elk Refuge? Is it A, Grand Teton Park Rangers, B, the National Forest Service? Watch this elk drop this antler. It's so cool. Ready? Watch. Ready? Oh! C, is it the Boy Scouts? Or D, is it the public? Go ahead and let me know in the comment section what you think the answer is, and we'll go ahead and discuss this one next month. And one lucky right answer will get a chance to win. Now, quick thing, guys. If you do want to win, you do have to tell me the answer on the Jackson Hole EcoTour Adventures broadcast of this program. If it's been shared to a page, for instance, and you answer on that page, I may not necessarily see your comments, which will make it a little harder for us to pick a winner. So you make sure you're on the Jackson Hole EcoTour Adventures page before you comment the answer. All right, so hopefully everybody got last month's question right and is thinking a little bit about this month's question. I think Orca, my cat, if you can hear her meowing, has strong opinions about the correct answer to this month's trivia question, don't you, Orca? Maybe she'll jump up behind me and you guys will get a chance to see her. In the meantime, I am here to answer your questions live. So if you have a question for me, go ahead and ask it in the comment section. Now, I've got my iPad in front of me here. So if you see me looking down, it's because I am looking at your questions as you ask them. And we'll kind of get to each one as we go here. So I'll sort of start up from the top. And let's see here. Oh, lots of right answers to the trivia questions. Mark asks, with the snowmelt coming on, what has been done to mitigate another horrible flood damage situation like happened last June? Great question. So for those of you guys unfamiliar, the north and northeast corner of Yellowstone National Park were badly devastated by a once-in-a-century flood last spring. And we're still seeing extensive repair. There's new roads that are being put in, new bridges, all sorts of infrastructure. And certain communities in Montana were completely cut off as a result of this terrible flooding. So that flood event was caused by extensive snowfall. Certainly we've had a record winter both in Yellowstone and down here in Grand Teton National Park. The local Jackson Hole Mountain Resort, our local ski resort, is almost at 600 inches for the season. And closing days in just a couple days here, and it just keeps snowing. So yes, we are going to have a very big snow melt. But the way that our snow melt works is all about temperatures. If it's really, really warm, really, really quickly, dramatically so, then you're going to get a huge torrent of water coming down out of the mountains, flooding these creeks, flooding rivers, and causing damage. If there's gradually warming temperatures over a period of months, which is more typical, then it doesn't actually matter how much snow we get. The ecosystem can adjust and absorb that increasing distribution of water. So what happened last year is we had 2 incredibly warm days after very, very cold conditions. So it stayed really cold and snowy and below freezing way, way unseasonably late. And then it hit the 80s for 2 straight days. And so we, instead of just melting that snowpack over 2 months, we melted that snowpack over 2 days. And that's what created such devastating flooding. That's a very, very unusual once in a century kind of event. Our hope would be that our snow melt, despite our extensive snowfall, will be more mild this year and will just take place over all of April and all of May and some of June. We're still going to have water coming roaring down. So hopefully we won't have any trouble. But this is a great question. Let's see what else we've got here. Oh, Tyler writes, this is great. Tyler says, hello everyone, sad I couldn't join Tenley in presenting today, but I'm looking forward to seeing you all next time. Thanks, Tyler, we miss you too, but we hope you're off having good adventures, so that's great. Now, just FYI, everybody, we are not going to be broadcasting in May because I'm going to be busy with Tyler doing guide training. We're going to be training all of the guides, so we will not be broadcasting the first week of May, but we'll join everybody in June. But in the meantime, let's see what else we've got here. Patrice asks, was the elk refuge behind Bo? I thought the area was under a lot of snow. Patrice, you're 100% right. The area is under a lot of snow. 2 things. Number one, for a lot of that video, no, the elk refuge wasn't behind Bo because we don't like to go right up to the elk refuge. We don't want to disturb the elk. Although, yes, some of that was filmed in the elk refuge. Number 2, that was a description of that green wave and that migration, which has not occurred yet. That was all the migration footage shot last spring. And last spring, there was a whole lot less snow on the ground than there is this year. So great question. Thank you for that. Let's see here. Okay, concerning the mountain lion flu issue, I've been reading about bighorn sheep that are getting pneumonia and dying off. Any details on this? Mark, this is a great question. So you're referring to ovoid infectious pneumonia is the technical term. And yes, this is a completely different disease, but also a respiratory illness that primarily affects bighorn sheep. It originally is a European disease that affected European sheep. And then when European sheep were introduced to the New World, they were infecting both bighorn sheep and mountain goats, native mountain goats, with the disease. So this is a disease that's got a lot of mystery to it. And our guide Kelsey, who is moderating the comment section, actually just wrote a huge, wonderful blog on this exact subject. So I'm hoping she will post her blog article about the latest research on ovoid infectious pneumonia. But the short version here is it's thought that, or historically it's been thought, that domestic sheep are transmitting the disease to bighorn sheep and mountain goats. And then mountain goats are actually transmitting this disease possibly to bighorn sheep as well, which leaves a lot of threat to our local Teton herd. There aren't any domestic sheep in Grand Teton National Park, but the mountain goats that are traveling between domestic sheep territory and wild sheep territory are maybe transmitting the disease to our wild sheep herd, which there are less than 150 bighorn sheep left in the Teton range. And ovoid infectious pneumonia is incredibly deadly. So I don't get to use the term decimate very often. Decimate would technically mean to kill 1 out of every 10 of something. Ovoid infectious pneumonia in a bad year will kill 9 out of every 10 bighorn sheep. It is a devastating disease. We don't know everything there is to know about it. We've got a lot of questions. Latest research seems to suggest that bighorn sheep populations may actually carry this disease, but as long as they have healthy immune systems, may not be transmitting it. There's other evidence that suggests that when bighorn sheep populations grow and they become numerous, they're more likely to have these outbreaks. So in other words, the more numerous the herd, the more likely that an outbreak is to occur. But yeah, there's a reason you should always report anytime you see coughing sheep to your local game and fish and wildlife department. The sooner they can catch these outbreaks, the fewer animals that will die. We are about 10 years away from our last major outbreak in the Grovant herd, which was particularly devastating. That herd has reached over 500 animals. Actually, it might even be over 800. I can't remember. But when those numbers get so high is when we begin to see outbreaks again. So keep an eye open for coughing sheep. We definitely want to know as soon as possible. It's probably inevitable that we're going to have another outbreak of that disease. It's definitely a devastating one. Definitely a little different than avian influenza, but is, of course, also a respiratory ailment. So lots of really crazy wildlife diseases that exist out there that we as humans aren't particularly worried about. But any mammal, any bird, of course, they're going to have the ability to have a lot of these same diseases that we have, or variations of these diseases as well. So great question. Thanks very much. Let's see here. Everybody hear orca? Perfect. Dawn asks, today I saw an osprey on a telephone pole in central Illinois, roughly 5 miles from a river. Do they eat strictly fish, or will they eat carrion or catch small critters? Great question, Dawn. They are straight piscivores. Osprey will eat fish and only fish. They won't eat carrion, or when it's been documented, but it would be incredibly rare for them to eat anything other than fish. So we do call them straight piscivores. They are fish specialists. Funny story, I used to rehabilitate and release ospreys back when they were a threatened species. Oh my gosh, my cat is so noisy today. Yeah, I used to raise and also release ospreys back when they were threatened species and still on the endangered species list. And we'd have to feed them fish in captivity. But osprey don't like to eat dead fish. And I didn't have a live fish to feed these osprey. So I would have to force feed them these dead fish that we were giving them. And they were not into it. And they would fight me really, really hard. Now, an osprey's about half the size of a bald eagle. They're not nearly as big. But a bald eagle is, to be honest with you, a giant wimp once they're intimidated. And so we would feed bald eagles also fish in captivity when they were damaged and needed rehabilitation. We kind of give them a nutrient paste that we would put inside the fish to make sure they're getting all the vitamins and minerals. There we go. I think you guys can see Orca. Is she? Oh, you can't quite see her. She just walked past me here. This nutrient paste, when it adhered to their feathers, was like glue, and it wouldn't come off. And so we'd actually have to pull feathers that this paste would get into. And the bald eagles, when they ate fish, I would just put fish in their enclosures and they would just stick their face in there because they are carrion eaters, and they would make this huge mess of their faces. And so a lot of the bald eagles that we had in these rehabilitation situations, they were bald. We had to pluck a lot of the feathers around their heads so they could regrow them, because this paste had kind of glued those feathers to the point where they weren't going to be able to use them and there wasn't any insulation. But generally, I could just put this fish in their enclosures and they would just eat it. It wasn't really a big deal. But the osprey, half the size of these bald eagles, refused. If I didn't force feed them, they weren't going to eat it all. It takes about, I don't know, you can walk into a bald eagle enclosure, and if you know what you're doing, you can force feed a bald eagle by yourself. But an osprey will fight you to the bitter end, and it takes about 4 people to hold an osprey down well enough to get them to eat their dinner. They are fighters. They are fierce. They are incredibly strong, aggressive animals when cornered. And of course, imagine a bunch of giant humans forcing your mouth open so you eat. Of course he was going to be aggressive. But I laugh that our national bird, who we think of as this big fierce animal, you know, you see all of like our US emblem of them holding the arrows and, you know, going to war. Bald eagles are wimps, you guys. They're total wimps when cornered. We should have picked the osprey, which would have fought to the bitter end. I have more scars on my hands from osprey bites, but I don't have a single scar on my hands from bald eagles, who never would have dared presume to bite me. So great question. They are straight piscivores. They only eat fish. They only eat living fish unless they give you no alternative. But I'm a great, great admirer of them. So very cool you saw one so far from a river. They will do that, particularly when they're looking for ideal nesting habitat. And of course, they do love to nest on top of telephone poles. So that might be one of those reasons. It is that time of year that you might have seen an osprey. So that's pretty fantastic, Don. Thanks very much for tuning in. Let's see what else we have here. your kitty. How is Orca doing? So everybody who hasn't heard her meowing in the background of one of these broadcasts before, Orca's great. She's called Orca because she's black and white. She loves water, and she's doing great. She had a dental recently, so she's a little under the weather. I think we might have talked about that in previous episodes, but she's fully recovered and she's doing fantastic and being very noisy today. So thank you guys for asking. Let's see here. Kelly, this is a great question. How many grizzly bears are estimated to be inside GTNP, Grand Teton National Park? Kelly, we don't know. So we use a variety of ways to count grizzly bears. And this question is actually an incredibly important question because as we begin to look at removing grizzly bears from the Endangered Species Act, where they're currently listed as threatened species, we need to understand what current populations are to be sure that they're meeting the objectives for a healthy population. We know using a method called Chow-2, which is sort of the best DNA analysis method that we have, that it is likely that we have over 1,000, maybe as many as 3,000 bears in the entirety of the Great Yellowstone ecosystem. But a male grizzly can have an incredibly large territory, and they could travel even 1,000 square miles, which is way more territory than Grand Teton National Park, in a single year. And so the problem is, what do you decide as a Grand Teton National Park bear versus a Bridger Teton National Forest bear, because the two of them are right next to each other, and most bears are going to walk right over the boundary line from a national park into a national forest into the National Elk Refuge into Yellowstone National Park. So we kind of have to look at them as an entire subpopulation. We have 3 major subpopulations in the United States. And the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem subpopulation is one of the largest, and that's between Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. So that would be Grand Teton National Park, Yellowstone National Park, and all the national forest and federal land surrounding those national parks. Altogether about 12 million acres of land. But even then, we don't have a really good count. Grizzly bears, it turns out, are really hard to count. You can't count them by helicopter. They're in the trees most of the time. You can't count them by trapping them. They're grizzly bears, so good luck with that. You can count them by doing DNA analysis, which is what Chow-2 does. They will leave bear urine on trees and other marking areas, and then they'll put these little hair traps, think of them like hair brushes, on the side of the tree, and then these male bears will rub on these trees to leave scent over the existing scent, and then they can take the hair from these tree rubs and they can see how many distinct individuals rubbed up against that tree, which will give them a relatively good idea of how many male bears there are in a certain geographical area. But it's not going to tell them how many females with cubs there are. And of course, it's females with cubs that are the key indicator of population. Bears are, as my college professor said back in the day, they're reproductive failures. They're really, really bad at reproducing themselves. The average grizzly bear is unlikely to replace itself in its lifetime to a real adult status. And what I mean by that is 50% of grizzly bears that are born die before they reach age 2, and they are free from their mothers. So yeah, we don't know. 1 to 3,000 is a great estimate. And I'm giving you such a wide number because I find that if there's 5 or 6 studies counting something, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. There's lots of political opinion on this. There's a lot of money riding on that answer. And so there's a lot of studies that are being done by a lot of people who have strong opinions about what the results should be, I guess is the best way to put it. So if you are in favor of keeping bears on the endangered species list, your results are probably going to show a slightly lower bear population. And if you're in favor of removing bears from the endangered species list, your results are probably going to show a bear population that's a little higher. The reality is probably somewhere in the middle. But yeah, this is an incredibly difficult question. And you notice I can't give you a wonderfully straight answer, but hopefully that gives you sort of a vague estimate. One thing's for sure, grizzly bear populations are recovered enough to be relatively viable. There are some long-term concerns, including the dramatic loss of over 80% of white bark pine trees, which are an incredibly important food source for them in the fall. There's concerns about the decline of army cutthroat moth, which is an incredibly important fat source for them. And of course, the decline of spawning cutthroat trout, which is an incredibly important food source for them as well, in terms of their long-term viability from being able to find enough food, particularly when we consider climate change, but also long-term viability from the perspective of genetic inbreeding, because we were down to less than 150 individuals left in the Great Yellowstone ecosystem when they were originally listed back in 1966 on the Endangered Species Act. So great success story. We have brought them from that 150 minimum number of bears back in the 1960s up to at least 1,500 of them today. That is fantastic news and really exciting stuff. But yeah, a lot of debate on the best thing to be done with grizzly bears. Do they go to the states, who are interested in, of course, hunting them and managing them and feel very strongly that they should have the right to take care of the animals that live within their states? Or do we keep them with the federal government, which is a very expensive proposition? You know, who pays for grizzly bears is part of this debate as well. So great question. Thanks very much for asking. Let's see here. Ingrid, great question. When is the best time to see trumpeter swans? Ingrid, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give you a great answer on this. So trumpeter swans are in decline throughout the United States, but are doing a lot better than they were. So another great success story, folks. We had less than 50 trumpeter swans left on the planet back in the 1970s. Today we have well over it's somewhere between 150 and 300, depending on how you want to do the counting again, right? Different scientific studies. But the greatest population is here in the Great Yellowstone ecosystem in the United States. A lot of work by the Wyoming Wetlands Society and other organizations to try to restore trumpeter swans and save the species. So the largest population of trumpeter swans in the world is located on the National Elk Refuge. And those swans do live there year round. Winter is a particularly good time to see those trumpeter swans, particularly on Flat Creek, just outside the town of Jackson. So if you'd like to see trumpeter swans, yeah, you can see them any time of year on the National Elk Refuge. But winter is a particularly good time. You can, of course, also see swans throughout the rest of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem year round. However, in the spring and fall during migratory season, just like right now, we do have tundra swans that are flying through. So definitely make sure you check your bird books and you look up your differences between your trumpeter swans and your tundra swans, and make sure you've got the right bird before you go ahead and confidently ID that. But yes, I'd say winter is the best time of year, but any time of year trumpeter swans are in view, and they're a common bird we see on our tours. So great question. Let's see here. Lois asks, did I get to see the Northern Lights this spring? Lois, boy, you know me. I have, I think, talked about Northern Lights a little bit on this program in the past. I'm obsessed with them, you guys. And I live somewhere that's known for its snow. So the short answer is, Lois, no, it's been cloudy for every single darn coronal mass ejection, but I'm hoping some of you guys got an opportunity to see some of these spectacular displays that we had, particularly in February. We had some KP levels, like KP7s and even a KP8 on one of these days. So for those of you guys who are not Northern Lights nerds, Northern Lights, of course, are caused by transmissions from the sun, interrupting our magnetosphere, which creates this reaction, which creates this really wonderful glow at both of our poles. And they're quite common at the polar levels. But the more strong and intense the solar storm that hits the Earth, the more likely you are to get really good lights. So there's a type of storm that the sun has called a coronal mass ejection that is particularly good in creating these massive solar storms that mean you get opportunities to see the Northern Lights in places like the continental United States. Now, the best way to get an idea of whether or not you have this opportunity or not is to go to one of my two favorite sources. One is called spaceweatherlive.com, and maybe Kelsey can link to it. It's just a wonderful group of nerdy scientists who make great, excellent predictions on how good Northern Lights are going to be. And of course, the Space Weather Observatory, which is NOAA, is the best source. They can make excellent both hour ahead predictions and 24-hour ahead predictions of whether or not Northern Lights are likely at your location. So they do this by measuring the KP levels in the atmosphere. So KP levels, just like anything else, it's just a scientific scale, much like the Richter scale, for instance, which is also exponential. Anything above a KP6 means Northern Lights might be in view right here at our altitude here in Jackson, Wyoming. But a KP7, you're definitely going to be able to see something with the naked eye. Something like a KP8, you might be able to see Northern Lights in places like Ohio or even south, and a KP9, which would be extraordinarily rare, you would be able to see northern lights somewhere like Florida. Once we get into the KP9, KP10 range, that's really not good. That's when we start to lose electrical grids and power, and we start to see the solar storm really affecting our power grids and our ability to function as an advanced society. Anything past a KP7, they have to put special shielding on the space station and special shielding on satellites to protect it from the intensity of the storm. So it may not look much like, might not be a big deal for a KP7 down here, but out in space, it can be quite a big deal if you're one of those astronauts. So I encourage you to go to one of those websites, learn a little bit more about what KP levels have to be in your area of the world where you live, and then maybe sign up for text updates or email updates when it is predicted that those KP levels will be high enough that you might have the opportunity to see northern lights at your location. If you've never seen them, they are amazing. They are well worth your time. They're well worth the wait, even if you have to wait up till 2 o'clock in the morning. Unfortunately, I live in a place that's really, really cloudy often in the winter because it snows all the time, and we're having a record snow season. So every single time we were supposed to have these amazing coronal mass ejections, it was snowing here in Jackson, so I didn't get an opportunity to see them. But I did spend some time earlier in my life up higher in the Arctic and got some great shows up there. And I've had some spectacular opportunities for northern lights down here in the Great Yellowstone ecosystem in the past. Just no luck yet this year. But hey, the year's young. We might get some more chances as we move on into the summer. So great question. Thanks for that. Linda asks, any 399 sightings yet? Linda, no. Despite the April Fool's articles. I don't know if anybody saw any of these. Local Buck Rail article, and I think News and Guide, our local paper, had one too, that 399 had emerged with 8 cubs, which I thought was a good April Fool's joke. No, she has not emerged yet. We have had 2 male bears emerge in Grand Teton National Park so far this season. That's about right. Male bears usually start showing up around late March, early April, followed by female bears without cubs, followed by female bears with cubs. Grizzlies emerge before black bears. 399 usually emerge right around the first week or 2 of May. So we've got a little time yet. If she doesn't have cubs, she usually emerges a little earlier, late April. If she does have cubs, she usually emerges a little later, early May. When I say emerges, she sometimes hangs out in the woods for a week or 2 before people see her out in the open. So first week of May might not be the day she emerges, but the day that she's typically seen. So keep your fingers crossed if she's got cubs this year. If she does come out with cubs, she will be the oldest bear in the Great Yellowstone ecosystem's history to have cubs. So yeah, pretty exciting stuff. Great question there. Let's see, another great question about 399 when she emerging. Thank you, Bethany, for that as well. Let's see here. All right, I think I got everybody's question. If you're watching this broadcast later and you've got a question, we'll be looking all week and answering those questions throughout the week as we can. So feel free to continue to ask them in the comment section, and we'll go ahead and we'll get you some answers. In the meantime, friendly reminder, we will not be on next month in May because we will be up in the field in Yellowstone National Park with all of our guides doing guide training. So we will miss you guys, but we'll be back in June. In the meantime, I hope everybody has a fantastic spring, a wonderful Easter. I hope it's sunny and full of flowers where you live. We will be under 600 inches of snow here, so no flowers, but I hope everybody just has a great opportunity to get outside, go enjoy the wildlife in your homeland, and you get a chance to tune in with us in June. All right, guys, so long. Thanks much.